Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Van Doren, Associate Director at Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and we at AMO responsible for administrating a little over 30% of the national allocation, which is over 2.5 billion currently. We felt it valuable to have this opportunity to connect with you on a few items. And before we commence that, think it's helpful to get sort of face to name. I'm going to take the opportunity to briefly introduce the team that's involved with administration. So I will start with Alia.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Alia Hyatt. I'm a program analyst with AMO CCBF team. I'm primarily responsible for financials and all functions across the CCBF reporting side. Jaden?
Hi everyone, I'm Jaden Walters. I'm a program coordinator on the CCBF team. My primary focus is project reviews and eligibility assessments and helping Alia with compliance issues. Lucas.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucas. I'm a communications coordinator for the CCBF. I help showcase projects on our website and social media and help coordinate any news releases or questions related to signage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is
Okay.
Erin Orr. I'm a program advisor and I provide capacity building support for asset management and housing. Now I'll hand it back to Chris to get us started.
Thank you. Just two housekeeping matters. We're doing a recording and we'll also be posting that and the presentation deck on the reporting site shortly after this session. Number two, if you have any questions, we're going to spend some time a little after the formal presentation, probably be about 15, 20 minutes or so, but we're going to spend some time on some questions that you might have. Please post them in the question and answer chat feature, and we'll get as many of them we can after the formal part of the presentation. So, moving on with the purpose. Our objective is to provide a compliance overview with the focus on meeting housing reporting requirements. And really, what we're trying to achieve is to ensure that the fund remains predictable, upfront, and flexible. We're going to talk briefly about the use of the funds, focusing on two issues: reserves reporting. Just a very brief time around the communications, but again, the focus is on the housing piece. And as I hope you've seen by that introductory video we sent in the invite, that there are many different approaches to meeting the requirements. And so we will attempt to speak a little bit about what that might be given your circumstance. In terms of use of the fund, in the site, there's a link to a document that provides really all the information you need to hopefully answer any questions you might have in terms of reporting site. In 2024, when the agreement was renewed, we did a presentation that's included there, which got into a little bit more detail of all the different elements of the agreement and how that might change. And we're also posting a compliance update presentation we did last year. So we're not going to go again into that detail. A reminder that on our buildingcommunities.ca site, there's a feature that you can search all historical and scheduled allocations. If you also go to the help area, you'll be able to see and project out for many years using the indexation model. But as any time, ask us if there's anything not clear, any questions that you might have. A reminder that the 2026 census will apply for the 2029 allocations, and as soon as we get that information, we'll report it for the next 5 years. So as we go by the fund and its flexibility, you can use it for whether it be new construction, enhancements, renewals, different types of areas that you might deem as priority for your municipality, and improving long-term planning or sharing with the community, banking the funds that you receive in advance. Important point is that municipalities decide how to direct their funds. And they do that again through their asset management, which has something been structured for their asset management plans for many years. We continue as part of our work, advocate and present to the federal government and provincial government an approach of looking at the maturity of asset management plan, again, indicating how municipalities use it to inform their investments. We also support that through several capacity building programs and initiatives. And then with the new agreement, this housing needs assessment, which applied to a certain number of municipalities, has something we've integrated into our conversations around asset management. The agreement it's a 10-year agreement, so expiring in 2033. There is a review period, and that review period will be in 2024. And part of getting to that is why we wanted to have this conversation, particularly around housing, so that we have the information to again make sure that the fund remains predictable and flexible. Okay, so one item I wanted to mention is about reserves. Canada has raised some concern with the growth in reserve, and this may not speak to you. It's not every municipality, but there are some municipalities that we're continuing to see a fair amount of growth. And along with that, a number and length of projects. And what we're talking to is projects that continue to be extended. And there are very good reasons why. But you're going to see us working with you to perhaps break some of these down for the purpose of really reporting some of the outcomes, giving you information in terms of the importance of transparency communication to the results. So we have been working with a number of communities where this is a bit of a concern, and we're going to continue to do that with the objective of releasing a report later this year that speaks to the growth and how it might be managed, and again, communicating to Canada that these funds are essentially committed to projects. But what we discovered in terms of our reporting site, because of the information that's coming in a bit late, it doesn't necessarily show that it's committed. So this is why we sort of emphasize the need to report a bit sooner. But communities generally can bank funds for 5 years. There are some exceptions we allow, but you need to work with us. And that continues to just be an item we'll be focusing on more individually with municipalities. On the next item I wanted to highlight is about the reporting cycle. So the reports are due at the end of April. For some, you might be sending it a bit later. I just want to emphasize that this year in particular, it's really important we get the information in sooner, like by April 30th. If not, we ask that you let us know. And you might take a bit more time, but we're going to be a little more diligent in terms of following up and working with you to get that information sent. It's going to help in a number of reports and data that we have to provide the federal government this year. It's also going to allow for a smooth flow of transfer of funds that are expected in July and November. And ask also that you, when you know your 2026 projects, which I suspect you should or would now, to enter them into the site. It gives that important line of sight. It helps us in our communications and activity and reporting. I would also just want to mention that our compliance audit, this is a random audit selection, that those municipalities part of that will likely get notified late April, maybe early May, and that takes place over May and June. Right. So I did want to just talk briefly about communications. You may have heard that the CCBF is going to be rebranded as called the community stream of the Building Community Strong Fund. Once we get further information on that, we will reach out, whether we do a webinar or provide clarity of information and documents that might apply to you. But we do not figure there will be any changes to the communication requirements as in Schedule E of our agreement with you. I spoke about the need to report in advance. The installation of signage in quarter federal guidance. While we still have linked here the tools and the examples, those I suspect will be the item that's going to be changing part of the rebranding. And I did want to point that another thing we've been working with municipalities directly in response to item flagged by the federal government is around the signage. As you know, it's required for projects over 100,000, total cost over 100,000, but we recognize there are exceptions or circumstances, and that's again in the guidance document. What we're asking is more communities to respond to that, and getting a little higher level of compliance is going to be important to address those concerns raised by Canada. Important to alert us about holding any events, acknowledge the fund when you're communicating. If you go to our website, our maps and other tools, you'll see that we promote and speak to hundreds of different projects every year based on the information that you provide us, and we have the capacity to support you in any of this work. Okay, so I am now going to pass the presentation to Aaron Orr, who's going to talk around the housing piece. And that's was the major component that is creating, I think, some confusion or was part of the renewed agreement for 2024. We have been working over the last couple years and most recently last few months to update our guidance through consultation. So I think one takeaway, hope that you read that guidance material. We're also working on other pieces of information to streamline reporting, but just to get as much of that readily available data that we can report without having to sort of burden you to get information. So we've truly tried to get information that we know we're going to use and collect anything that's already available where we can. And that's sort of have been our approach. So Erin, I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Chris. So yes, as Chris mentioned earlier, asset management is an important consideration for project selection, but as are housing needs. And the CCBF can be leveraged to support housing and affordability through strategic infrastructure investments. I'm going to begin the presentation with a quick overview of the actual housing requirements within your CCBF agreements. So first, municipalities are expected to prioritize projects that support the growth of the housing supply, where it makes sense to do so. And if your municipality has a housing needs assessment per the federal template, this should be referenced as well to guide project selection. So you'll notice in the agreement, and anytime we're speaking to you on the subject of housing, we frequently repeat this phrase, where it makes sense to do so. This is because the fund remains a flexible program that appreciates your ability to make strategic decisions based on your unique needs. In other words, we know that infrastructure needs related to housing affordability and housing gaps differ across each municipality, and in fact, they may not even exist in your municipality. We also understand that you might already have other funding sources to direct towards housing needs. So for these reasons, municipalities can continue to use their own discretion when selecting eligible projects. Now, if a housing project is selected, and construction is complete, municipalities must then report on quantitative and/or qualitative outcomes related to housing. We have developed a detailed guidance document that Chris mentioned for housing reporting that can be accessed using the QR code here, but we'll also be sharing the links with the presentation. So over the next few slides, I'm going to provide a high-level 3-step summary for housing reporting. The first step is to identify a housing project. You'll notice some new features on the reporting site as of this year. Upon adding a new project under general information, you'll be prompted to identify the project as either housing related or not. At first, it's just a simple yes or no question. But then how do you know whether a project is housing related? We can start by having a look at the definition. So project is related to housing if it either enables or preserves housing units, meaning that the infrastructure increases your community's capacity to build new housing units or conserve existing ones. So for more clarity, I have some examples on the next couple slides. So this is a long list of examples. It is non-exhaustive. Housing projects can include new buses added to the transit system, road and bridge widening, construction of a new roundabout, some stormwater network improvements, expansions to the community center, extensions to active transportation networks, brownfield redevelopment, and even capacity building initiatives like a feasibility study or doing some growth updates for your official plan. So CCBF can be used for the non-growth portion of growth-related projects in these cases. So in your project selection, we also want you to remember your housing needs assessment if you have one. Infrastructure gaps that are identified in your H&A, specifically Section 7, should be addressed by CCBF whenever possible. Let's take a look at 3 more examples with a little bit more detail. So when you're adding a new project to the site and you've determined that it is housing related, the project objective should highlight the link to housing. For example, the rehabilitation of a stormwater network that is no longer performing at full capacity will reduce flooding and reduce the risk to existing homes in the area. This is a great example of housing preserving infrastructure. Now, a more obvious housing project is a greenfield development. For example, the installation of new water mains and residential connections, which enables new homes to be connected to the water network. And my last example is a road widening or expansion of the active transportation network. This type of project alleviates traffic pressures that have emerged as a result of growth in the area. So these are all examples of an objective that could be included in the reporting site to describe the link of your project to housing. Now, once you have identified a project as housing, what's next? Steps 2 and 3 involve reporting the outcomes. Another new feature on the reporting site will appear upon project closure. Only if you have marked the project as housing related, you'll be prompted to provide either a quantitative outcome or a qualitative outcome. And these are the questions that you'll see appearing on the results page. So let's start with quantitative. You can provide a quantitative outcome in the case that a project can directly result in the development of new housing units. We're looking for municipalities to provide the number of housing units potentially enabled by the infrastructure project. Municipalities can determine how best to calculate this number themselves. We just ask that you share the methodology that you've used with us. To calculate the number of units enabled, kind of have a two-step process. You first define what a housing unit is. So this can be housing starts, planned developments, projected housing, or even zoning allowances. And then once you've done that, you just need to determine which housing units are directly linked to the project in question. I actually have a couple examples too to illustrate how this would work. An enhancement to the wastewater treatment plant may result in increased capacity for the plant. The number of new connections that were made possible from this investment could be counted as new housing units enabled. Another example that we've already mentioned is greenfield development. So roads or underground infrastructure that is newly added to your community. In these cases, the number of housing starts or the number of housing units planned for development can be counted. Now, if I know there's probably going to be a lot of cases in which a project seems housing related, but a quantitative measure might be too difficult to determine or even seem impossible to be attributed to that project. In that case, you guys are welcome to instead provide a qualitative description. So the aim of a qualitative description is to emphasize the link between the project and housing needs. Here are some questions that can help with your responses. You can ask yourselves, how does the project increase capacity for housing development and alleviate growth pressures? How does the project conserve existing housing or contribute to housing affordability? Are there other quantitative measures to show the linkage with housing, such as the amount of population impacted or the number of housing units that have been preserved? And finally, how does data or analysis in your housing needs assessment guide this decision making? A few sentences should be sufficient to describe the connection of the project to housing. If you're interested in reading more examples, the housing guidance includes over 20 specific examples of how to report on housing outcomes. On my last slide, I'm going to conclude with a quick summary of some housing guidance, much of which I've already mentioned. So the first is we recommend that municipalities use the CCBF to fund projects that are closely aligned with your municipality's asset management plan and housing needs assessments. Second, CCBF can be used to fund the development charge ineligible portion of growth-related projects. Third, the CCBF should be used strategically without impacting other municipal revenue sources, such as DCs. Fourth, the CCBF can be leveraged with other provincial and federal funding sources. For example, the Provincial Municipal Housing Infrastructure Program. Just remember that CCBF is considered a federal funding program for stacking purposes. Fifth, we ask that you please ensure you are identifying a project as housing related in the reporting site by referencing the reporting guide for help. And lastly, the project description entered in the reporting site under the objective should clearly articulate a project's connection to housing and/or housing affordability. So with that, I can hand it back to Chris to go over some resources, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Thank you, Aaron. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have in our reporting site a link to documents and FAQs. Reach out to us at any time you have the contact with questions. We do want to point out a couple of webinars that are coming up around how to write an H&A and how to use an H&A that we're working with SHS consultants. showing a lot of how the information we get and we report it. You'll think the project maps, housing needs assessment map, asset management map, and reports we also provide to Canada, as well as our links for social media.